His racist Karen neighbor made his life a living hell. But when she collapsed, the black teen next door saved her without hesitation. What she did the next day, no one could have predicted. This shocking story of hate, heroism, and redemption will leave you speechless, because the ending changes everything. The sound of a slamming door shattered the peaceful morning. Marcus tensed, his grip tightening on the basketball he had been dribbling in his driveway. He didn't have to look to know who it was. "You people don't know how to keep quiet, do you?" The voice was sharp, coated in disgust. Mrs. Wallace, the Karen next door. At 17, Marcus had lived beside her long enough to know what was coming. The glares, the accusations, the insults. It was like clockwork. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at him like he was an intruder in his own neighborhood. "I swear, every time I step outside, you're out here making a racket. Do you even have parents who teach you manners?" She sneered. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. His mother always told him, "Don't give people like her what they want. Just keep being you." "I'm just playing basketball, ma'am," he said, his voice controlled but firm. But Mrs. Wallace scoffed, stepping closer. "Oh, don't you ma'am me. I see you people on the news, always up to no good. And don't even think about walking near my property. I have cameras now." The words stung, but they weren't new. Mrs. Wallace had been like this for years, calling the HOA on his family, complaining about suspicious activity when Marcus walked home from school, even accusing him of stealing her Amazon packages, only for them to be found in her own bushes. His mother told him to ignore it. "She's bitter, baby. But hate doesn't win. Remember that." But Marcus, he was tired. Tired of being treated like a criminal in the neighborhood he had lived in since he was 4. Tired of the way Mrs. Wallace's friends whispered when he rode his bike past their houses. He wanted to yell, to scream, to tell her that she was the problem, not him. But instead Marcus did the hardest thing. He turned around and walked away. He didn't see Mrs. Wallace's reaction. He didn't need to, because he knew this wouldn't be the last time. She would always hate him. That would never change. Or so he thought, because 24 hours later, everything he believed about Mrs. Wallace was about to be shattered. The next morning, Marcus was in the garage, fixing the chain on his bike when he heard it. A scream. Not the usual angry rant Mrs. Wallace threw his way. This was different. Desperate. Terrified. Then, a loud crash. Marcus shot up, his heart hammering in his chest. He sprinted toward the sound, bursting onto the driveway. And that's when he saw her. Mrs. Wallace was lying on her porch, gasping for air. One hand clutched her chest. The other reached out, fingers twitching like she was grabbing for something that wasn't there. Her face was twisted in agony, her skin pale, sweat beading along her forehead. Marcus froze. A million thoughts rushed through his mind. After everything she had done, everything she had said, should he help? The woman who had tormented him for years, who treated him like a threat instead of a neighbor, now lay before him, vulnerable, helpless. A part of him whispered, "Let her be. Walk away, just like she would if it were you." But then another voice, his mother's, cut through the anger. "Hate doesn't win, baby. You don't let it change who you are." And Marcus knew. It didn't matter who she was. It didn't matter what she had done. He couldn't watch someone die and do nothing. He ran up the steps, dropping to his knees beside her. "Mrs. Wallace, can you hear me?" he shouted. Her lips trembled, eyes wide with panic, but she couldn't speak. She was fading. Marcus grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. "I need an ambulance. My neighbor, she collapsed. She can't breathe." The dispatcher fired off questions, but Marcus was already moving. He had taken one CPR class 2 summers ago, never thinking he'd actually have to use it. But now, as he watched Mrs. Wallace's eyes flutter, her breaths becoming shallower, instinct kicked in. He tilted her head back, checked for breath, started compressions. "Come on, stay with me. Breathe." He pressed down, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3. He could hear the sirens in the distance. 4, 5. Mrs. Wallace's body jerked slightly, her chest rising in a shallow breath. Marcus let out a shaky exhale. his pulse racing as the ambulance screeched to a stop in front of the house. Paramedics rushed up the steps, pushing Marcus aside as they took over. He stepped back, watching as they placed an oxygen mask over her face, loading her onto the stretcher. And then, for the first time in his life, Marcus saw something in Mrs. Wallace's eyes that he had never seen before. Fear, not of him, not of the world, but of dying. And maybe, just maybe, something else. Regret. He swallowed hard, gripping the railing as they carried her away. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens wailed, Marcus stood frozen, breathing heavy, heart pounding, and one thought echoed in his mind. I just saved the life of a woman who wished I didn't exist. But what Marcus didn't know was that the real shock was coming the next day. Marcus barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mrs. Wallace gasping for air, the fear in her face, the way her body went limp before the paramedics arrived. He had saved her. But would she even care? Would she even remember? Deep down, he already knew the answer. She would never change. She would never see him as anything more than the black kid next door, the one she called Trouble, before he even spoke a word. The next morning, Marcus dragged himself downstairs, expecting the usual routine. Breakfast, a little basketball, another day pretending like his neighbor didn't hate him. But as soon as he stepped outside, his stomach dropped, because standing on her porch, leaning on a cane, was Mrs. Wallace, and she was looking right at him. For a second, Marcus thought maybe he was seeing things. She had just been on death's door. How was she already back home? Then, before he could turn away, she did something that made his entire body freeze. She stepped off her porch and started walking toward him. Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart pounded. Every instinct told him to leave, to go inside before she could say something cruel. But then, he saw her face. And for the first time since he had known her, Mrs. Wallace looked different. Not angry, not disgusted, not full of hatred. She looked nervous, like she was about to do something she had never done before. And then, she opened her mouth. Her voice cracked and she swallowed. I need to talk to you. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink, because nothing in the entire world could have prepared him for what came next. Mrs. Wallace's lips trembled, and then her voice broke. Marcus, I'm sorry. For a moment, Marcus forgot how to breathe. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything Mrs. Wallace had ever said to him before. Sorry? She was sorry. This was the same woman who called the HOA on his family for having a cookout. The same woman who once accused him of casing the neighborhood when he was delivering groceries to his mum's friend. Marcus had imagined this moment 100 times, but in every version, it wasn't her apologizing. It was her getting what she deserved. But now, standing in front of him, Mrs. Wallace wasn't the same person. Her usual sharpness, the bitterness in her voice, it was gone. Her eyes were different too. Not hard, not full of resentment, just tired, human, small. I know what you're thinking, she whispered, gripping the cane in her shaking hands. That I don't deserve to say it, and maybe I don't. Marcus felt his jaw clench, his chest tight with emotions he didn't know how to name. Why? The word came out before he could stop it. Mrs. Wallace exhaled shakily. Because, when I was lying there, gasping for air, her voice cracked. I thought I was going to die. She looked away, staring at the ground, as if she couldn't bear to meet his eyes. And the last thought I had wasn't about my family. It wasn't about my regrets. Her lips trembled. It was you. Marcus's breath hitched. You, standing over me, trying to save me. After all the things I've said, all the ways I treated you, and all I could think was, why would he help someone like me? Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Marcus felt something deep in his gut, something he didn't want to feel. Pity. Mrs. Wallace looked up then, and her next words shattered everything. I was raised to believe certain things. That people like you didn't belong next to people like me. Marcus's fists clenched, his pulse thundering in his ears. People like me? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. But when I was dying, none of that mattered. It wasn't the people who looked like me that saved me. It was you. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to reject this moment. He wanted to say, "Too late. You don't get to take it back." But instead, all he could do was stand there, listening to a woman who had spent her life hating him, now begging for forgiveness. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mrs. Wallace whispered. "But I need you to know. I see it now. I see you." Her voice broke. "And I was wrong." Marcus felt something hot sting the back of his eyes. He turned his head slightly, blinking hard, forcing the lump in his throat down. Because he never, not in a million years, expected this. But what was he supposed to do with it? Marcus stood frozen, his mind at war with itself. He had spent years dreaming of this moment, of the day Mrs. Wallace would finally see him, not as a problem, not as a threat, but as a person. And now, here it was, an apology, a confession, a plea. But why did it feel so hollow? Marcus swallowed hard, his emotions tangled in knots. "You're sorry," he said, his voice flat. Mrs. Wallace flinched, like she had expected him to yell. But Marcus didn't have the energy for anger. "Sorry doesn't erase the things you've said." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I know." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Sorry doesn't erase the way you treated my mom, or the way you called the police on my uncle just because he was parked outside." Mrs. Wallace sucked in a shaky breath. "I know." Marcus's hands balled into fists. "Sorry doesn't change the fact that if I was the one lying on the ground yesterday, you wouldn't have saved me." Silence. Mrs. Wallace didn't answer. She didn't even try. And that was the moment Marcus knew. He was right. If the roles had been reversed, if she had found him on the pavement gasping for air, she would have stepped over him, closed the door, called someone else to deal with it, and that realization burned. Mrs. Wallace lifted her head again, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Marcus, I can't change the past, but I can try to be better now." He inhaled sharply. Because that was the thing about hate. It didn't just disappear in a day. It didn't just go away because someone had a change of heart. It left scars. And now, standing face to face with the woman who had made his life hell, Marcus had to decide. Would he hold on to the anger that had been building for years? Or would he choose something else? His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Hate doesn't win, baby." He let out a slow breath. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he admitted, his voice raw, real. "But I hope you mean what you said. Because if you don't, then none of this matters." Mrs. Wallace wiped at her eyes, nodding. "I do. I swear I do." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And for the first time in years, Mrs. Wallace didn't stop him. Days passed. Mrs. Wallace didn't come outside. No shouting, no complaints. For the first time in years, the street was silent. And Marcus, he didn't know how to feel about it. He kept expecting things to go back to normal, for her to call the HOA again, for her to glare at him through the blinds. But she didn't. Instead, something strange started happening. It was little things at first. A hesitant wave when he passed by. A package left at his family's doorstep with a note that simply read, "Thank you." But the real shock came 2 weeks later. Marcus was biking home from school when he saw it, a for sale sign on Mrs. Wallace's lawn. His breath caught. She was leaving. A lump formed in his throat, but he shook it off. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe some people just couldn't change. But the next morning, as Marcus went outside to shoot hoops, he noticed something on the edge of his driveway, a small brown envelope. He hesitated, then picked it up. His name was scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. Mrs. Wallace's handwriting. Heart pounding, Marcus carefully opened it, pulling out a folded letter, and what he read made his chest tighten. "Marcus, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I wanted to say this to you in person, but I don't think I would have had the courage. You were right. If it had been you on the ground that day, I wouldn't have helped, and I hate myself for that. I've spent my whole life seeing the world the wrong way. You didn't deserve what I put you through. No one does. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you changed something in me. You saved my life, and you saved me from myself. That's why I'm leaving. I need to start over. And maybe, one day, I'll be the kind of person who deserves to live next to someone like you. Thank you for showing me who I really was. And thank you for proving that hate doesn't win. Eleanor Wallace. Marcus's fingers trembled as he folded the letter. He had never seen her first name before. For years, she had just been Mrs. Wallace, the racist old woman next door. But now, she was something else. A person who had finally seen herself for what she was. A person who had finally changed. Marcus let out a slow breath, staring at the empty house, and for the first time in his life, he felt lighter, because maybe he couldn't forgive her. Maybe he never would. But for the first time, he didn't have to carry her hate anymore. It was hers to hold now. And Marcus was free.